It was a warm evening in the quiet suburb of Bellwood, a neighborhood where everybody seemed to know each other, the kind of place where trust was assumed and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. At the corner of Maple Avenue stood a modest brick home with a neatly trimmed lawn, the kind of house that seemed ordinary at first glance. Inside that house lived 18-year-old Ethan Calloway, a bright and ambitious young man, preparing to begin what he hoped would be a promising future. Ethan had recently graduated from high school. His achievements, graduating top of his class and receiving a partial college scholarship, were a source of pride for his single mother, Dana. She had raised him on her own, working long hours at the local diner to ensure Ethan had every opportunity she never did. For Ethan, the future seemed wide open, full of possibility, but his path would soon take a tragic turn. One of the closest people to Ethan was his uncle, Michael Calloway. Michael, in his early 40s, was Dana's younger brother and a regular fixture in their lives. A charming and charismatic man, Michael had been the family's dependable support system, often stepping in to help when Dana struggled to make ends meet. To outsiders, he was a devoted uncle who cared deeply for his nephew. But within the walls of that home, there existed a bond between them that was far more complicated. Ethan often sought guidance from Michael. To him, his uncle was worldly, experienced, and understanding, a contrast to his mother's strict, overprotective nature. Michael encouraged Ethan's curiosity, treating him less like a teenager and more like an equal. Over the years, the two became close, spending weekends together on fishing trips or movie nights, creating memories that seemed harmless to those around them. Michael had recently moved into a nearby apartment after spending years traveling for work. His return to Bellwood seemed to bring comfort to Dana and Ethan alike. But it wasn't long before Michael's presence became more frequent. Whether it was dropping by for dinner or inviting Ethan over to help with odd jobs around his place, Michael was always around. For Dana, this was a relief. Michael had become a surrogate father figure to Ethan, filling a gap that had been absent for years. But what Ethan saw as mentorship was evolving into something far more personal. It was during one of those weekends at Michael's apartment that the dynamic between them shifted. Ethan started spending more time there, drawn by his uncle's openness and the allure of independence away from home. Michael had a way of making Ethan feel understood. His words were encouraging, his demeanor warm, and his home a retreat from the pressures of school and family. The small apartment became a space where Ethan felt free to share his dreams, his fears, and eventually, his vulnerability. Their relationship became a closely guarded secret, known only to the two of them. To Ethan, it was a connection built on trust and understanding. Michael had become someone he could confide in, someone who made him feel safe. Yet, the decisions made during these visits would alter Ethan's life in ways he could never have anticipated. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan began noticing changes in his health. They were subtle at first: an unusual fatigue, the occasional fever that wouldn't break, and other symptoms he didn't fully understand. Concerned but reluctant to worry his mother, he kept it to himself. Michael, however, noticed. One evening, as Ethan sat on the couch, visibly unwell, Michael reassured him that everything was fine. "You're probably just stressed," he said with a calmness that didn't match Ethan's growing unease. It wasn't until a routine doctor's visit that Ethan learned the truth. The results of his blood work were devastating. He had tested positive for HIV. In an instant, his future, once brimming with potential, now seemed clouded by fear and uncertainty. Ethan was too stunned to speak, his thoughts racing as the doctor explained what the diagnosis meant. Ethan returned to Michael's apartment that evening, desperate for answers. It was there, in the dim light of the living room, that Michael admitted his secret. He had known his HIV status for years and had never told Ethan. The revelation shattered the bond they had shared, leaving Ethan overwhelmed by anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. What had once felt like a safe haven had now become the source of his deepest pain. Before we continue, we notice that over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to the channel. If you're enjoying this story, please support us by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss an update. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so don't forget to leave a comment below. This is only the beginning of Ethan's story, a tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and a path that would soon lead to a shocking and violent end. After the devastating revelation of his HIV status and Michael's betrayal, Ethan's life began to unravel in ways he couldn't control. At first, he attempted to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He told no one, not his mother, not his friends. He couldn't bring himself to share the burden of what had happened. But the weight of the secret bore down on him, isolating him from the world he once felt part of. Ethan became withdrawn, his once bright demeanor fading into something quieter and more troubled. At school, he avoided his closest friends, brushing off their concerns with weak excuses about being tired or stressed. At home, he grew distant from his mother, no longer sharing the small details of his day like he used to. For Dana, it was as if her son had slipped through her fingers without warning, and she didn't know why. The truth, however, was something Ethan couldn't escape. The physical symptoms of his condition became harder to hide. He began missing classes, unable to muster the energy to leave his bed on some mornings. His teachers noticed the change, but their calls to Dana yielded no answers. She was as much in the dark as they were. As Ethan's health worsened, so did his mental state. The betrayal from Michael consumed his thoughts, playing on a loop he couldn't silence. Every moment they had spent together, every conversation, every laugh, felt like a lie. He couldn't reconcile the image of the uncle he had admired with the man who had knowingly endangered his life. The anger he felt was raw, overwhelming, and inescapable. Despite his efforts to avoid Michael, their paths inevitably crossed. Michael would still stop by the house to visit Dana, casually asking about Ethan as if nothing had changed. Ethan's stomach churned every time he heard his uncle's voice in the next room. He wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but he couldn't. Not yet. Then, one night, Ethan overheard a conversation that shattered any hope of closure. Michael and Dana were talking in the kitchen, their voices low but audible from where Ethan sat in his room. Michael mentioned moving out of town, referencing a new job opportunity he had been offered. Dana encouraged him to take it, her tone light and supportive, unaware of the storm raging within her son just a few feet away. To Ethan, the idea of Michael leaving felt like a cruel twist of fate. It wasn't just the thought of him escaping accountability. It was the realization that Michael might never face the consequences of his actions. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface began to boil over. Ethan couldn't let him leave. Not like this. Not without answers. Not without justice. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's behavior grew more erratic. He started skipping school altogether, spending hours wandering the streets or sitting alone in the park, replaying the events of the past few months in his mind. His thoughts grew darker, more consuming. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been irrevocably altered, stolen from him by someone he trusted most. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan found himself walking to Michael's apartment. He hadn't planned to go there, but his feet carried him to the familiar building without hesitation. Standing outside the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His heart raced, a mix of anger and fear pounding in his chest. Finally, he knocked. When Michael opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to unease. Ethan stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his movements tense and deliberate. The small apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words. Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He confronted Michael directly, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and pain. "How could you do this to me?" he demanded. Michael, caught off guard, stammered in response, offering excuses that only deepened Ethan's anger. He claimed it was a mistake, that he hadn't meant for this to happen, but his words rang hollow in the dim light of the room. The conversation escalated quickly. Ethan's voice grew louder, his accusations sharper. Michael tried to deflect, to regain control of the situation, but it was clear he was losing. The carefully constructed facade he had maintained for so long was beginning to crack. And in that moment, Ethan saw his uncle not as the charismatic figure he once admired, but as a coward desperate to avoid accountability. Their argument ended abruptly when Ethan stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. The confrontation hadn't brought the closure he sought. It had only left him feeling more lost and more enraged. As he walked home under the flickering streetlights, a single thought repeated in his mind. This wasn't over. Ethan's world was unraveling faster than he could hold it together. The betrayal, the diagnosis, the confrontation, all of it had pushed him to the edge. And with each passing day, he felt himself slipping further away from the person he used to be. What he didn't realize was that the next steps he took would not only change his life forever, but would also seal the fates of everyone involved. In the days following his confrontation with Michael, Ethan's emotions oscillated between anger, despair, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. He stopped returning phone calls and texts from his few remaining friends. The once ambitious teenager who had spoken excitedly about his future now spent his days locked in his room, blinds drawn, the silence broken only by the occasional muffled sound of his mother bustling about the house. Ethan's thoughts became consumed with a singular focus: justice. In his mind, justice wasn't something that could be served through courts or authorities. He had convinced himself that the legal system would fail him, that people like Michael always found a way to avoid consequences. After all, Michael had lied so easily, hidden his secret for so long. To Ethan, it felt like the only way to take back control was to act on his own. But with every passing day, his resolve was tested. Doubt crept into his mind. He wrestled with questions he couldn't answer. Was he really capable of doing what he imagined? Could he live with the consequences? And what if he was wrong? What if there was another way? These questions didn't silence the storm inside him. They only fueled it, making his thoughts darker and more relentless. One evening, as Dana sat at the kitchen table, sorting through bills and sipping coffee, Ethan came downstairs for the first time in hours. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but his voice was calm as he asked her about Michael. Dana, sensing something was wrong but unsure of what, answered cautiously. "He's doing fine, I guess," she said. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Just wondering if he's still moving away." The question seemed odd to Dana, but she didn't press him further. Ethan lingered for a moment before retreating back to his room, leaving Dana with an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite place. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling the same relentless path. He knew Michael's patterns: when he left for work, when he returned home, when he was most likely to be alone. The details of Michael's routine had been etched into his mind over the years, and now they felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. The following day, Ethan left the house early, telling his mother he was heading to the library to work on a school project. In reality, he wasn't headed to the library. He wandered aimlessly through the town, his steps heavy, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: an opportunity, a sign, or perhaps just the courage to follow through with the thoughts that had consumed him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan found himself standing outside a hardware store. He hesitated before stepping inside, his heart pounding as he scanned the aisles. He told himself he was only browsing, but his actions betrayed his thoughts. A short while later, he left the store with a small bag in hand, the contents hidden from view. When he returned home that evening, Dana noticed the faint traces of dirt on his jeans and the exhaustion in his eyes. "You've been out all day," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Are you okay?" Ethan offered her a weak smile and nodded. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." Dana didn't push further, but as she watched him climb the stairs to his room, her unease deepened. Ethan's plan began to take shape over the next few days. He avoided Michael's apartment, knowing his presence might arouse suspicion. Instead, he spent his time carefully preparing, each step meticulous and deliberate. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning. He couldn't. This was something he had to face alone. On the night Ethan decided to act, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. He waited until his mother had gone to bed before slipping out of the house, the small bag from the hardware store tucked under his jacket. The streets were quiet as he made his way to Michael's apartment, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. When he arrived, he stood outside for what felt like an eternity, his pulse racing. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but now that it was here, the weight of it threatened to crush him. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, his breath shallow and unsteady. The door opened before he could knock. Michael stood on the other side, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion. "Ethan? What are you doing here?" Ethan didn't answer. He stepped inside, his movements deliberate but unsteady. Michael closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch clicking into place loud in the silence that followed. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with unease. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, the words he had rehearsed struggling to form. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You ruined my life." Michael's face paled, his unease turning to fear. He stepped back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Ethan, listen to me." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "You don't get to talk your way out of this. You lied to me. You knew, and you didn't care." The argument escalated quickly, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Michael tried to defuse the situation, but Ethan's fury was unrelenting. Years of trust, admiration, and love had been shattered, leaving only the raw pain of betrayal. And then, in an instant, everything changed. What happened in that apartment would send shockwaves through the quiet town of Bellwood, leaving a trail of questions and devastation in its wake. But in that moment, as the rain began to fall outside, the world inside that small apartment grew darker than anyone could have imagined. No one would know the exact words exchanged in the minutes that followed, but neighbors later recalled muffled voices rising and falling, a sharp contrast to the typically quiet night. What began as a heated argument spiraled into something far more volatile. Ethan, his emotions raw and unchecked, lashed out with the full force of the anger and betrayal he had been harboring. The shouting between him and Michael grew louder, spilling out through the thin walls of the apartment. A neighbor down the hall later reported hearing something slam, perhaps a chair or a table, followed by a chilling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Inside the apartment, Ethan's rage had boiled over. What started as a verbal confrontation quickly escalated into violence. Michael tried to reason with him, his voice tinged with panic, but Ethan wasn't listening. In that moment, it wasn't just about Michael. It was about everything Ethan had lost, the future he felt had been stolen from him, and the overwhelming pain he could no longer contain. It was just after 10 p.m. when the first cries for help were heard. A woman in the neighboring apartment called 911, reporting sounds of a struggle and what she believed to be someone pleading for their life. The dispatcher tried to gather more details, but the caller was too shaken to provide much beyond her fear that something terrible was happening just a few feet away. The rain outside intensified as the struggle continued. Ethan, fueled by months of anger and despair, had overpowered Michael. The scene inside the apartment was chaotic. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, evidence of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. But it was the silence that followed that would haunt the witnesses for years to come. When police arrived minutes later, they found the door ajar, the lock broken. The officers entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the dim light of the apartment. What they found inside was nothing short of horrifying. Michael's body lay motionless on the floor, his face pale, his chest unmoving. The signs of a struggle were everywhere: bruises, scratches, bloodstains marking the floor and walls. Ethan sat just a few feet away, his knees drawn to his chest, his hands trembling. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes distant and unfocused. It was as if he hadn't fully processed what had just occurred. The officers approached carefully, their voices calm but firm as they instructed Ethan to stand and put his hands behind his back. He complied without resistance, his movements slow and mechanical. As they placed him in handcuffs, he didn't say a word, his gaze fixed on the ground. One officer stayed behind to secure the scene while the other escorted Ethan to the patrol car. Outside, the rain poured in sheets, soaking Ethan's clothes as he was guided into the back seat. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights of police cruisers and ambulances. Whispers filled the air, questions about what had happened and how a quiet night in Bellwood had turned into something so unimaginable. In the hours that followed, investigators began piecing together the events of the evening. The apartment was combed for evidence, fingerprints, blood spatter, and anything that could shed light on what had led to the violent encounter. Michael's body was removed from the scene, his cause of death preliminarily listed as blunt force trauma, though a full autopsy would be required to confirm the details. Ethan was taken to the local police station, where he was placed in an interrogation room. For hours, he remained silent, his head bowed, his hands shaking. When detectives finally sat across from him, he spoke only a few words. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." His voice was barely above a whisper, a mix of exhaustion and regret. As the night wore on, details of Ethan's motive began to emerge. Through a combination of his initial statements and evidence from the scene, investigators learned about the complex relationship between him and Michael. The betrayal, the hidden truth about Michael's HIV status, and the devastating impact it had on Ethan's life all pointed to a motive rooted in pain and anger. But even with this context, the question remained: what had pushed Ethan to the breaking point? By morning, news of the crime had spread across Bellwood. Local headlines described the tragedy in stark terms. Teenager accused in fatal attack on uncle, a family torn apart by secrets and violence. The small town, known for its quiet streets and close-knit community, was now the center of a story that left everyone searching for answers. Dana, unaware of what had transpired the night before, was awakened by a knock on her door. The officers who stood on her porch delivered the news with a mix of professionalism and sympathy, but their words hit her like a freight train. Her son was in custody, accused of murdering her brother. It was a moment that would shatter her world and leave her grappling with the impossible task of reconciling the two people she loved most. The fallout from the crime was immediate and far-reaching. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers began to weigh in, their opinions dividing the community. Some saw Ethan as a victim of unimaginable betrayal, driven to act out of despair. Others viewed him as a criminal who had crossed a line that could never be undone. But for those closest to the tragedy, the labels didn't matter. What had happened was irreparable, and the wounds it left would take years to heal, if they ever could. As Ethan sat alone in his holding cell that morning, the weight of what he had done began to sink in. He had sought justice, but the cost had been greater than he could have imagined. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the storm clouds outside, he realized that his life, and the lives of everyone around him, would never be the same again. The town of Bellwood awoke to the shocking news, the once quiet community now gripped by whispers and speculation. For Dana Calloway, the morning began with disbelief and devastation. The weight of losing her brother and learning that her only son was the one responsible felt insurmountable. She sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the coffee she had poured hours earlier, now cold and untouched. The silence of the house felt suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional murmur of a newscaster repeating the details of the crime. Dana wasn't allowed to see Ethan that morning. The officers who had come to her door explained that he was being held for questioning and that his arraignment would likely happen within a few days. She nodded mechanically, her mind struggling to comprehend the situation. The family she had worked so hard to hold together was now irreparably fractured. Ethan's arrest became the talk of the town. For those who knew the Calloways, the news was both shocking and tragic. Ethan had always been seen as a kind, hardworking teenager, someone destined for a bright future. Michael, on the other hand, had a reputation for charm and generosity, often stepping in to help his sister and nephew. The revelations of their complicated relationship, one that had remained hidden for so long, left neighbors and friends questioning everything they thought they knew. As the investigation progressed, the details of what had led to the crime began to emerge. Detectives uncovered the truth about Michael's HIV status and the devastating impact it had on Ethan's life. They discovered text messages and emails exchanged between the two, painting a picture of a relationship that had once been close but had grown strained in the months leading up to the tragedy. These messages, combined with Ethan's initial statements, provided a glimpse into the emotional and psychological turmoil he had endured. The prosecution was quick to frame Ethan's actions as premeditated. They pointed to his purchase of items from the hardware store and his calculated decision to confront Michael on that fateful night. To them, it was a clear case of intent, a young man seeking vengeance for what he saw as an unforgivable betrayal. But Ethan's defense team painted a different picture. They argued that he was a victim, not just of Michael's deceit, but of the emotional and mental toll it had taken on him. They brought in psychologists who testified about the impact of betrayal trauma, highlighting the way it can drive even the most rational individuals to act out of character. They described Ethan's actions as the result of a moment of emotional overload, not a cold and calculated plan. The trial, which began months after the crime, drew significant media attention. Reporters flocked to Bellwood, eager to cover the case that had captivated the nation. The courtroom was filled with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the community, all watching as the events of that night were dissected in painstaking detail. Dana sat in the gallery every day, her face etched with grief. She listened as both the prosecution and defense presented their arguments, each word a reminder of the son she had raised and the brother she had lost. She refused to speak to reporters, her silence a shield against the onslaught of public scrutiny. Ethan took the stand during the trial, his testimony a critical moment in the proceedings. His voice was quiet but steady as he recounted the events leading up to the crime. He spoke about the close bond he had shared with Michael, the sense of betrayal he felt upon discovering the truth, and the overwhelming anger that consumed him that night. Tears filled his eyes as he admitted, "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't go there to kill him. I just wanted him to understand what he did to me." The courtroom was silent as Ethan's words hung in the air. For some, his testimony elicited sympathy, a tragic story of a young man pushed to his breaking point. For others, it was a weak attempt to justify an unforgivable act. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The sentence was handed down shortly after, 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. It was a decision that left the community divided. Some felt it was too lenient. Others believed it was too harsh for a teenager who had acted out of desperation. As Ethan was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned to look at his mother one last time. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. Dana mouthed the words, "I love you," tears streaming down her face. Ethan nodded, his expression a mix of regret and acceptance, before disappearing through the door. In the years that followed, the Calloway family would never fully recover from the tragedy. Dana sold the house on Maple Avenue and moved to a smaller apartment in the next town over, hoping for a fresh start. She visited Ethan regularly, her love for him unwavering despite everything that had happened. But the loss of Michael lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the night that had changed their lives forever. For the town of Bellwood, the case became a cautionary tale, a story about trust, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept too long. The name Calloway, once synonymous with resilience and family, now carried the weight of tragedy. And for Ethan, as he sat in his prison cell each night, he was left with the echoes of his choices and the knowledge that he would spend the rest of his life grappling with what might have been if only he had taken a different path.